Welcome to the Rare History Channel. 13 Shocking Facts About Fidel Castro. As the political leader of Cuba from 1959 to 2008, Fidel Castro, nicknamed El Comandante, was the face of left-wing totalitarianism. Though Castro's educational reforms significantly improved the system of education in Cuba, they often came at the hand of communist policies that left its citizens impoverished as well. While most of Castro's reforms proved harmful, a few paved the way for advances in Cuban health and education. Here are the most shocking facts about Fidel Castro. Fact number 1. Fidel Castro survived more than 600 assassination attempts. Character assassination was the aim of the plot to depilate Castro's face, but, through the years, U.S. intelligence agencies also formulated many aborted or unsuccessful plots to actually take Castro's life. Although it is questionable whether they undertook the 634 attempts to kill Castro that were claimed by Fabian Escalante, the former head of the Cuban Department of State Security, there is abundant evidence of U.S. government plots to assassinate Castro. Some of them were very strange indeed. Two of the oddest revolved around Castro's passion for scuba diving. One called for an explosive seashell to be planted in an area where he liked to dive, and the other involved a wetsuit tainted with a disease-causing fungus and a tuberculosis-laced breathing apparatus that were to be given to him. Other proposed instruments of death included a fountain pen that concealed a hypodermic needle so fine that being stabbed by it would be undetectable, botulism toxin pills to be administered to Castro by a former lover, and both poisoned and exploding cigars. Number 2. Baseball phenom. According to a long-perpetuated legend, Castro was a hard-throwing pitcher who caught the eye of Major League Baseball scouts. In one wholly fictitious version, concocted by Don Hoke, a journeyman major leaguer, Hoke was at bat in a Cuban League game that was interrupted by anti-Batista student protesters. Among them was Castro, who took the mound and delivered several wild but blistering fastballs that Hoke struggled to foul off. Another version of the legend revolves around Washington Senators scout Joe Cambria seeking out pitching prospect Castro but not being impressed enough to sign him. Had Castro's heater had a little more oomph, the story goes, there may never have been a Cuban revolution. In truth, Castro was an accomplished high school athlete who was named Havana's Outstanding Schoolboy Sportsman in 1943-44. He excelled in track and field, in the high jump and middle distance running, basketball, playing for the University of Havana's freshman team, and table tennis. What's more, he pitched for his high school baseball team as a senior. He reportedly did appear, uninvited, at two of the tryouts held by Cambria but failed to distinguish himself. Castro later cemented the image of himself as a baseball player with a famous pitching appearance for the Cuban Army team in an exhibition played before a minor league game between the Rochester Red Wings and the Havana Sugar Kings in July 1959. Castro's biggest connection with baseball, however, was as the #1 fan of Cuba's national sport and as a kind of behind-the-scenes general manager of the national team, which had great success internationally. Number 3. Castro imprisoned and tortured homosexuals. Under Fidel Castro's regime, homosexuality was viewed as a crime against the state, and the government actively persecuted those who identified as gay or lesbian. Thousands of individuals were rounded up and imprisoned in brutal labor camps, where they were subjected to torture, abuse, and forced labor. It wasn't until the 1980s that the Cuban government began to relax its stance on homosexuality, and even then, it continued to be viewed with suspicion and discrimination. Number 4. Castro's daughter became a vocal critic of his regime. Elena Fernandez, Fidel Castro's daughter from an affair he had in the 1950s, became a vocal critic of his regime. She fled Cuba in 1993 and has since become an outspoken opponent of her father's policies, particularly his human rights abuses and his suppression of political dissent. Fernandez has written extensively about her experiences growing up in Cuba and the difficulties she faced as the daughter of a dictator. Number 5. In 1960, Castro nationalized all U.S.-owned businesses based in Cuba. Castro believed a country classed as socialist if its means of production were controlled by the state. The businesses he nationalized included oil refineries, factories and casinos, all high-grossing industries. He did not offer compensation to the U.S. owners. This prompted the United States to end diplomatic relations and impose a trade embargo on Cuba, which continues today and is the longest trade embargo in history. Number 6. In July 1953, Castro led a failed attack on the Moncada army barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed. Castro was captured and sentenced to 15 years in prison while many of his men were killed. In memory of the Moncada attack, Castro renamed his group the 26th of July Movement, MR 26-7. Batista, trying to counter his authoritarian image, released Castro in 1955 as part of a general amnesty. Now free, Castro traveled to Mexico where he met Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. Together, they planned a return to Cuba. Number 7. Castro was friends with iconic revolutionary Che Guevara. In November 1956, Castro and 81 others sailed aboard the Granma to the eastern coast of Cuba. They were immediately ambushed by government forces. Castro, with his brother Raúl and Che Guevara, hastily retreated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains with a few other survivors but almost no weapons or supplies. Number 8. Castro's supporters viewed him as a revolutionary hero. Despite the controversies surrounding his regime, Fidel Castro's supporters viewed him as a revolutionary hero who stood up to American imperialism and championed socialist ideals. Castro's vision of a Cuba free from the influence of the United States resonated with many people, not just in Cuba but across Latin America and beyond. Number 9. Castro executed thousands of political dissidents. During his time in power, Fidel Castro's government executed an estimated 10,000 political dissidents, many of whom were accused of crimes such as counter-revolutionary activities and treason. The executions were carried out without trial, and many of those killed were innocent of any wrongdoing. The government also imprisoned and tortured countless others, creating a climate of fear and intimidation that lasted for decades. In 2003, Castro executed his methods on a larger scale when 75 people, human rights activists, journalists, and trade unionists, received his abusive tactics following their outspoken criticism of the Cuban government. Number 10. Castro was a skilled orator. Fidel Castro was a gifted public speaker and known for his passionate speeches, which often lasted for hours. His charisma and powerful rhetoric helped him to rally support for his regime and inspire loyalty in his followers. Castro's speeches were a key part of his leadership style, and he used them to communicate his vision for Cuba and to denounce his enemies, both real and perceived. Number 11. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. After the United States imposed an embargo on Cuba, Fidel Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. The two countries formed a close alliance, with the Soviet Union providing military and economic aid to Cuba. This alliance would prove to be a thorn in the side of the United States, which saw Cuba as a potential threat to its own security and interests in the region. Number 12. Castro was an advocate for universal healthcare and education. Despite his oppressive regime, Fidel Castro was also known for his advocacy of universal healthcare and education in Cuba. The country's healthcare system is considered one of the best in the world, with a high life expectancy and low infant mortality rate. Similarly, Cuba's education system is highly regarded, with free education available to all citizens from primary school to university. Number 13. Castro was a prolific smoker. Despite his history of respiratory problems, including asthma and emphysema, Fidel Castro was a passionate smoker and reportedly smoked up to 80 Cuban cigars a day. The iconic image of Castro with a cigar in hand became synonymous with his rule over Cuba and was seen as a symbol of his defiance against the United States.